You know, when you think about history, it's easy to see it as just a list of separate events. But what if it's more like a relay race, where one great empire, right as it starts to fade, passes the baton of power to the next? Well, today, we're going to dive into one of the most incredible examples of this, the great Muslim dynasties that really shaped the Middle East for centuries.
So we're really going to try and answer this one big question. How does power actually shift from one great empire to another? I mean, it's never this clean, simple handoff, right? It's always a messy story of ambition, of weakness, and of perfect timing, where the fall of one power literally creates the perfect opening for the next one to rise up.
Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we'll set the scene in what was truly a time of dynasties. Then we'll meet the first runner in our race, the great Seljuk Empire. After that, we'll watch Saladin and the Ayyubids grab that baton and then get into the wild story of the Mamluks. I mean, from slaves to sultans, you can't make this up. And finally, we'll see how this whole incredible era wrapped up.
All right, let's get into it. We're stepping into a world where power wasn't about nations the way we think of them today. No, it was all about these incredibly powerful ruling families, these dynasties. And they're the ones who would leave this huge mark on the culture, the science, and the politics of the Middle East for literally hundreds of years.
And this is how that relay race works. First, you have the Seljuks, who build this massive empire, but as they start to weaken, the Ayyubids are right there ready to step in and claim that legacy. And then, when the Ayyubids start to crack, who rises up? The Mamluks, their own former soldiers. It's this continuous story with each dynasty building on the foundations and, let's be honest, sometimes the ruins of the one that came before it.
So our first runner off the block is the Seljuk Empire. Try to picture this. A nomadic group of Turkic people from the steppes of Central Asia just explodes onto the scene in the 11th century. I mean, they went on to build one of the most influential empires of the time, and they totally set the pace for everyone else who came after.
And if you need a face for Seljuk power, this is it. Sultan Alp Arslan. This guy was a powerhouse military leader who massively expanded the empire. He really solidified their power and prestige, and he represents the Seljuks at their absolute undeniable peak.
But look, the Seljuks weren't just about military strength. Their real genius was using that strength to create stability. I mean, by controlling this huge territory from Anatolia all the way to Persia, they created a space where art and science and architecture could just explode. They built everything, grand mosques, hospitals, you name it. It was a time of incredible intellectual growth.
Of course, no empire lasts forever, right? The Seljuks started getting hit from the outside by the European Crusaders, but at the same time, they were being torn apart from the inside. You had princes and generals from the same family constantly fighting for the throne, and it just shattered their unity. That 1-2 punch started to weaken their grip, and by the 12th century, our first runner was definitely starting to stumble.
So, as the Seljuks are losing their grip, and the whole region is breaking up into smaller pieces, a new power was just waiting to grab that baton. And this brings us to the Ayyubid dynasty, founded by one of history's most famous figures who saw a huge opportunity in all that chaos. And that person, of course, is the legendary Saladin. He was this brilliant military strategist who worked his way up the ranks and managed to unite all these different Muslim groups across Egypt and Syria. He basically took advantage of that power vacuum, ended the rule of the rival Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, and boom, established his own Ayyubid dynasty.
And Saladin's dynasty wasn't just about war, not at all. Their rule actually kicked off a period of real economic prosperity. I mean, a piece of pottery like this one tells a story. It's a little window into their artistic contributions and the booming trade they built up, especially with states in Europe.
When you look at the whole picture, the Ayyubid legacy is pretty amazing. They were known for religious tolerance, which was great for keeping the peace, and, for business. They invested a ton in infrastructure, like new canals for farming and these schools called madrasas for education, and they left behind these incredible buildings, like the famous Citadel of Cairo.
But here we go again, the classic problem when an empire is built around one amazing leader. After Saladin died, his empire was split up among his relatives, who almost immediately started fighting each other. The unity he had worked so hard to build just started to fall apart, which left this massive question hanging in the air. Who on earth could hold it all together now?
Well, the answer to that question is one of the most unbelievable stories in all of history. The next group to snatch that baton of power came from the most unlikely place imaginable. Let's talk about the Mamluks.
Now, the name itself, Mamluk, actually comes from the Arabic word for slave. And that right there, that's the key to their entire story. These guys weren't royalty, they weren't nobles, they started at the very bottom.
So here's the deal. The Ayyubids and other rulers before them had this practice of buying young slaves, mostly of Turkic or Mongol origin, and training them to be an elite force of soldiers. They were fiercely loyal and incredibly effective warriors. But over time, they became so powerful that they were able to just overthrow their Ayyubid masters and take control for themselves in 1250, an unbelievable turn of events.
But the Mamluks' legacy is so much more than just their origin story. For one, they are credited with something huge. They basically saved the holy cities of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem from the Mongol invasion, which seemed totally unstoppable at the time. They also turned Cairo into a massive hub for art and intellect, sponsoring scholars like the great historian Ibn Khaldun. They proved they weren't just warriors, they were protectors of culture.
But, and I know this is starting to sound familiar, the Mamluks' biggest weakness was themselves. They didn't really have a clear system for who would rule next, so power was usually just seized by the strongest commander. This led to constant, brutal infighting. That internal chaos, plus new pressures from outside, eventually just wore them down. And that opened the door for the final runner in this race, the Ottomans, who conquered them in 1517.
And just like that, our relay race of dynasties comes to an end. It's pretty amazing when you step back and look at it. You can see this really clear pattern of how power was passed along for almost 500 years.
Yeah, this timeline really lays it all out. You can see the Seljuks dominating at the beginning with their rivals, the Fatimids, right there alongside them. Then check out that overlap as the Ayyubids start to rise just as the Seljuks and Fatimids are fading. And look at that messy transition from the Ayyubids to the Mamluks. It wasn't a clean break at all, but this slow transfer of power over years.
Which brings us to the big takeaway here. Every single one of these dynasties added something new and valuable to the region's incredible history of art, science, and architecture. But every single one of them also carried the seeds of its own downfall, that internal division, the constant fighting over who gets to be in charge. It was this endless cycle of amazing creation followed by a totally predictable collapse.
So that kind of leaves us with one final thing to chew on. When you look at this centuries-long relay race, where these incredible leaders built amazing legacies, only to see them torn apart by their own successors, what does that teach us about power, about leadership, and about the incredible challenge of actually building something that's meant to last?